All right, hello and welcome to my TED Talk. I am Nathaniel Prugh, and I just want to start out by saying that languages are freaking insane. Take a look at that language tree. It's pretty dang cool. I'm going to break it down for you. I don't know if many of you are familiar with what language trees are, but essentially these on the right are all the languages of Europe, or most of them, and these are languages of the Middle East and North India. What is common with them is the fact that they come from the same ancestor language known as Indo-European. So at one point in time, there were people in Europe and on the steppe of Asia that spoke the same language, and that language eventually evolved to become everything you see on this tree. This happened over centuries, over millennia. It took a very, very long time. I just find it fascinating because languages have a genetic relationship. Of course, it's not like human DNA, but the fact that languages relate to one another, I find it incredibly fascinating. So you may be wondering if any languages today sound like Proto-Indo-European that was spoken millennia ago. And in fact, yes, there is at least one. Lithuanian. So the French linguist Antoine Millet said that anyone wishing to hear how Indo-Europeans spoke should come and listen to a Lithuanian peasant. Essentially what that means is when Lithuanian developed its grammar, its morphology, its syntax, its vocabulary hasn't changed drastically from when it was first spoken. And I find that fascinating. Furthermore, Lithuanian is considered to be very old because it is obviously similar to other ancient languages. I am talking about Sanskrit. There are uncanny resemblances between Lithuanian and Sanskrit. Lithuanians take so much pride in this. Many linguists have stated that Lithuanian is in fact the oldest language in the whole Indo-European tree. I'll just say these out. We've got Sunas Viras Avis Domas Padas Ugnis, and then Sunas Vira Avis Domas Padas Agnes. So I probably said the Sanskrit or the Lithuanian accent, but whatever, you get the idea. Like, they look similar, and it's cool. Anyway, all of that I just explained is where I got my inspiration to come up with my research question, which is, what is linguistic relativity, and where can we see it manifested in the world? I'm going to explain to you what linguistic relativity is. It's basically the idea that languages influence your cognition. They influence your perception of reality. There's a small difference. So linguistic relativity is more famously known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, named for the two linguists credited with developing it. Linguistic relativity is the more loose version, saying that like language somewhat influences cognition. It doesn't have a huge bearing on it, and of course cognitive aspects do of course influence language more than vice versa. It may sound confusing, I'll get to that later. Linguistic determinism, on the other hand, is kind of hated by most scholars because it says that language absolutely affects your perception of reality, and that cognition is held within the bounds of language. And cognitive scientists and linguists kind of hate that. So they're like, no, that's wrong. It goes against like all of our long-standing science. You can't just come in here and put that dumb hypothesis on us and expect us to go with it. Anyway, these are the two men credited with developing it. Benjamin Whorf is credited with more of it because he was the one that did the initial studies. He is the one that came up with the idea of linguistic relativity, and his mentor, Edward Sapir, just kind of helped him publish it, make it look better, prettier. They eventually did kind of really work together to like finalize the idea, but I'm going to be focusing on Benjamin Whorf because he was really the pioneer of this all. He discovered it when he was studying the Hopi language. He was doing a little case study on it, and at one point he noticed that the Hopi language does not have tenses, so no way to denote time, no way to talk about past, present, or future. And he thought that was really, really interesting, and he was thinking about, well, if they don't have tenses to talk about time, then what does their time look like? Like, for Europeans and for people who speak European languages, time is linear, basic Newtonian mechanics. There are instances, and then those instances are the present, and then, there's the future and the past. It's pretty straightforward. And it's just something that, I don't know, I can't really imagine, not thinking like that. But Worf was asking the questions how do Hopis talk about what is and what is to come, or what was and what is to come. He concluded that Hopis have a different time because of their language and their culture, and just how insanely different it was, and how it developed away from most languages of the world. I'm going to read to you a little quote about what Worf thought about the Hopi language and kind of what he discovered. Kind of his thoughts about the language and how time manifested itself. So, to the Hopi, there is no temporal future. There is nothing in the subjective state corresponding with sequences and successions conjoined with distances and changing physical configurations that we find in the objective state. So I'm going to break that down a little bit because it's confusing, I know. It's even difficult for me to understand, and I've been researching this topic for quite a while. So as I understand it, there is no future grounded in the world or relating to time in the Hopi language. Any feeling of aging or the passage of time is about the extent of the Hopi's understanding of time, and events that happened millennia ago or far away seem to hold no bearing in the Hopi language. So it's almost as if the Hopi language operates within the deserts of Arizona. It's their own little universe. That's how I think of it. So Hopi time is intrinsic to its people, and the lands and the culture of its people. And you pretty much have to be born Hopi and raised speaking Hopi to understand all of this. It's very abstract. Worf even said that there are no words in English which can describe Hopi time adequately. So, huge language barrier there. So you might find all of that interesting. It was really cool in my opinion. However, Worf was wrong. He was wrong about all of that. Alright? And when I found that out, I was about to just bang my head on my keyboard. I was just so frustrated. This is so cool. And then there's just scathing critiques and no mercy. No mercy for Worf. So yeah, when you talk about how language influences cognition, you're not only gonna attract the attention of linguists, you're gonna get psychologists, cognitive scientists, you're gonna get scholars of culture as well that notice your work. And Linguistic Relativity attracted the attention of all those people. It really didn't gain recognition until about 10 years after his death in the 1940s. So around 1950s and 60s, people started noticing it, and all the attention given to the Linguistic Relativity was pejorative at best and defamatory at worst. People did not like it. I'll tell you why. He was criticized for using anecdotal evidence. He didn't really have solid empirical evidence, it was just anecdotal. Like, this one time I heard the grammar was being used like this, which means in turn it's different from English in this way, which means they must conceptualize this in this way. Kind of like that. There's nothing empirical about it. The philosopher Max Black published a scathing report that Worf's ideas about metaphysics show, and I quote, amateurish crudity. This man was not well liked. Others disparaging critiques included he had no real evidence, like I stated, not clear about how language influenced thought. And his examples of linguistic relativity were often anecdotal, speculative, and served to show that foreign and exotic grammar systems are foreign and exotic. He was so disliked in the linguistic community that he was dubbed the prime whipping boy of the linguistic introductory texts. And then here's the kicker, here's my favorite one. Worf didn't have an academic degree. That discredits everything he did, I guess. However, I would argue that the most fatal blow to linguistic relativity, the most scathing critique, came from one Eckhart Molutke. He did a far more thorough investigation of the Hopi language. He's about 80 years old. He's been living in Arizona for quite some time. He actually teaches Hopi studies in Arizona. I forget what university, but he's been there a long time. He actually found that Hopi does have tenses. So in fact that discovery just destroyed the foundation of linguistic relativity. If Hopi has tenses, then what proof is there that they think about time differently? And I'm going to show you how it's denoted. It's very, very subtle. It's just the bold and underlined NI at the end of the verb. That's it. So still very different. Here's one of the biggest reasons why nobody liked linguistic relativity, was because it went against the universal basis of cognition. And essentially that went like, cognition influences speech. That's the gist of it. Language only exists because of thought. Of course, animals don't have speech, they can think. Noam Chomsky, for instance, he's one of the linguists that championed the universal basis of cognition, and is still very well known today. And his idea about the interpretation of language was cognition, then language. Language serves first to internalize the world around you, and then you use speech to execute those computations of the world of which you see, I suppose. And so according to them, because of this mode, language cannot influence thought whatsoever. It's cognition, then language. You can't have language and then think. It doesn't really make much sense. Now, linguistic relativity claims that, of course, yeah, cognition influences language, yeah, but it also influences cognition too. Sometimes. Not all the time. Of course, I wouldn't be talking about linguistic relativity if people still were hating on it today, like they used to. And they begin to realize that Worf's ideas weren't so insane as they thought they were. It was mostly that people would look at linguistic relativity and they would expect to find spectacular examples on how language could influence cognition. For example, like people looked at Hopi time and they were looking for more examples like that. Hopi time is so incredibly different. Like, how does that work? But in reality, linguistic relativity is very, very nuanced. It's very small. It's really even hard to notice. And Worf got really excited about the really small, nuanced things, which many of his critics just overlooked. He saw ideas and he saw trends in grammar and lexicons that were fundamentally different from that of other language families, and he concluded that there is a slightly different cognitive process here when addressing such and such issues that are concerned with such and such grammar. Furthermore, Worf also accepted the universal basis of cognition. He accepted a pre-linguistic mode of cognition, meaning cognition without speech. So yeah, people were wrong about him as he was just as wrong about Hopi tenses and Hopi time.
You're good.
Okay. So this is the continuum for further research. The scholars that developed it, they developed it in a climate where the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or linguistic relativity was still not too popular. And they have this little disclaimer that says, this is the most amicable solution to discussing it. We don't want to seem intellectually nihilistic. Come on, guys. I just love that terminology, intellectually nihilistic. And so how it works is you take a certain cognitive function, like language affects time, maybe in English, not at all. In Hopi, maybe a little bit. And then on the far side, where language definitely affects cognition, you got full-blown Morphean Hopi time. It definitely affects cognition. And so the idea is you take different cognitive functions and you put it on this spectrum, because many scholars have recognized no, linguistic relativity won't affect everything, but it can affect some things and some greater and some less. And that's really the whole point of this, is to be more amicable in researching this whole subject. Alright, so to wrap this all up, I have this really cool map. But I also wanted to say that yes, we need to make sure that that continuum is really put into further research. I think it's incredibly important. More research about linguistic relativity means more understanding about other cultures. Take a look at this map. Each color represents a language family. It's not perfect. For example, the blue is Romance, the red is Germanic, the light green over there where Russia is, and Poland, that's Slavic. You got the Persian languages in purple, the Semitic languages in orange. I believe these are the Bantu languages in green. And then of course you see like all of these that are just on their own. Those are native languages, and what's crazy is a lot of them aren't even remotely related to one another. Like I discussed in the beginning about how Indo-European has many, many languages. Well, many native languages are isolates, meaning they are related to nothing else. And I find that very, very interesting. So what does that all mean? Why did I bring this up? Well, learn a language. It's really cool. Like all of that is a testament to the human history of speech. And it's just incredibly interesting to see how different cultures are shaped just because of language. Lithuanian, for example. People over there were just amazed and dumbfounded that I spoke their language with less than 3 million speakers. They thought it was kind of dumb. Some people thought it was really cool. But it was awesome, and not only like increased my appreciation for the culture and the people, but it also increased my cognitive abilities to learn more languages, which is awesome. But yeah, learn a language, really, really cool, really good for you, and it just helps you understand culture much, much more. Thank you.
Exactly 8 minutes. All right, we're going to turn to questions now. So audience members, please feel free to ask questions if you have them, and then panelists obviously as well.
Susie?
I have a question, which is, can you give me give examples of some of the subtle things that Worf proposed as differences in languages that make that? I mean, are there any like easy examples to give that make people approach life?
Yeah, these aren't what Worf came up with. Some of these are from my own observations. I actually got some of them from your French class. And then there's other studies. One is color cognition. So like researchers would have a color wheel. They would pick a color, and then they would tell the person to look away and remember the color. They bring out a different color wheel with all the colors in a different place and tell them to pick the color that they saw. And based on what they picked, it was supposed to reveal things about color naming schemes in their native languages. A better example, I think, is like when we were talking about how you say "I am bored" in French. What is it? Je m'ennuie. That's right. I bore myself. Instead of "I am bored," it's like you own the boredom, and that may have some sort of tendency as to influence behavior. Like I don't know, on a larger scale, there might be some sort of slight behavioral difference in that. In Lithuanian. What was that example I was thinking of? When you say, Never mind. DJ?
I was curious, since you've obviously had first-hand experience having been on exchange and learning and speaking another language in its native country, have you noticed any, while you're speaking that language, any sort of cognitive difference or any personality changes or anything like that while you're speaking that language?
Yes, but I don't know if that has to do with linguistics. That could do with the culture and the history of the country. Like, Lithuania is very dismal. I wouldn't say they're depressing people, but they're serious, they're to the point. They can be joking, of course, as well. They can be very fun, but an outward appearance is very stoic. I don't think that has much to do with the language as it has to do with 70 years of Soviet occupation. But well, I would have to think about that more and think of like specific instances. I don't know, I guess like when you say I like, you don't say I like, you see for me it suits. Like man patinka, you say for me it suits. Like for me this is good. I don't know, and that I don't know how that would be different, but I found that was interesting. Jack?
When did you first start learning Lithuanian?
Pretty much when I got there. Like my mom got me a Lithuanian language learning book for Christmas before I went on exchange. I didn't really understand what I was doing. And, like, I was speaking like I was horribly mispronouncing things, and I got over there and I'm like, dude, you're pronouncing that terribly. But yeah, I learned it on exchange. Kyle?
So I'm really fascinated by the question of like, if the Hopis were untensed. And I know there are languages that are maybe not completely untensed, but limited in their tense, right? Or if there's any sort of concept that doesn't exist in one language but exists in another. How is it that the people in the language that lacks that structure are able to think about that concept? So if it's the future, right? If there's no future tense, and we still have a concept of the future, we can still talk about that. And I'm just interested in how that works, and if you can expand that at all. I know that in the Hopi it turned out they were wrong. There is a tense, but I don't think that's the case for every language.
How I would answer that is, here we have linear time. Sequences follow one another, and I would assume in languages that don't have tenses, it's more like eventually this will happen. Eventually something will happen, but it's not like they can pinpoint a certain day on which it will happen, like we have in our very organized linear time system. That's how I think about it. That's a really tough question.
Yeah, and maybe take it out of tenses. I'm thinking about like, I mean, there's all sorts of constructs that we use language to describe, right? Whether it's like a piece of technology that exists in the United States that doesn't exist in Lithuania, or you show up in Lithuania, they've got things you've never seen before, right? And you don't have a translation for it because it's not here.
Yeah.
How is it that if you look at it your way as an English speaker going to Lithuania, what did they have that you didn't understand, and how did your mind go about understanding it?
I don't know. It'll take a long time to think about, I think mostly because there weren't concepts which I discovered which were so radically different from English that I couldn't conceptualize them. I think it was the grammar itself that was hard to conceptualize, but I think that comes with most language learning.
I guess I'm looking to see if there's like a link between that and say like if you're studying astronomy.
Okay.
There are concepts that you aren't capable of understanding until you're given language around them, and then once you have that language around them, you're able to think about them.
Okay.
Right? So like if you're talking about black holes or quasars or whatever, like as a child you don't know what that means, but then as you start to build that language, and I'm wondering if it's a similar thing to how you learn like an advanced technical idea, is it similar to how you learn a cultural idea? But I'm not sure if you have an example to do that, and I don't speak another language, so I don't either. Or I don't speak Spanish well enough to be able to have had that experience.
I would assume my experience was similar to your example of how once you become associated with things like quasars and black holes, you're able to understand the discussion around them. And that was largely my experience as well, of course. Like, it was just total immersion. I'd hear words constantly, and eventually, like, once I could pronounce them, I'd ask what they mean, or deduce from context what they meant. And of course, the more words I learned, the more I was able to understand about the discussion happening around those words. I don't know if that was the answer you
I
were
think it's
looking
reasonable
for.
All right, we're gonna stop there, and Nat, we're gonna send you out for a moment. Thank you.